Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on one of the hottest topics in real estate, why buyers need to choose location carefully. With markets rising almost everywhere in Australia, it feels like you could buy almost anywhere and get rapid capital growth. And in the short term, that may be true. But what about next year and the next 5 years? What if you buy in haste and pay too much to beat the competition, or your chosen location lacks the growth drivers for long-term sustainable growth? That's why the headline for this webinar is Buy in Haste, Repent at Leisure. And I'm joined today by Miriam Sandkuhler of Property Mavens, award-winning buyer's agent and best-selling author of the very good book, Property Prosperity, to discuss why investors and home buyers need to be precise about location and price, even in a runaway property boom. So Miriam, welcome.
Thanks, Terry. It's fantastic to be here, and it's a super important topic that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, I'm sure you're seeing it, but I'm seeing evidence that the people are just doing silly things. They're getting a little bit carried away with perhaps the hype and the euphoria and thinking that they can do almost anything and the market will cover their mistakes if they make them, but it's not necessarily the case.
Absolutely. There's a lot of FOMO going on. There's a lot of desperate people buying very poor quality property because a lot of it's come to the market. It's always in a seller's market that rubbish stock hits the market and people unwittingly buy it. And in addition to that, we've got some data to talk about as well and go through, just to explain how people can get tripped up with that as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I'd just like to let everyone who's watching and listening today know that if you've got any comments or questions, you can type them into either the chat box or the Q&A panel that you should see in front of you on your screens. And after Miriam's gone through her presentation today, we'll deal with as many of your questions as we can.
Fantastic. So as we spoke about, Terry, buy in haste, repent at pleasure. That's what we're going to talk about today. As usual, there's a disclaimer here saying that we're not providing any sort of advice to anyone. Seek your own independent accounting, legal, finance and property advice from an expert before you embark on or action any of the things that we discuss today. A little bit very quickly for those of you who may not know who Properties are. We are a multi-award winning property advocacy firm. We have expertise in buyer and vendor advocacy. So we work with clients of all ages to help them buy and sell smart, which enables them to achieve their desired outcomes and seamlessly move on to the next stage of their life. And ironically, we're working with a lot of clients who are upsizing, downsizing, selling, then buying, buying, then selling. A little bit about me very quickly as well. I'm a licensed agent, real estate agent working as a buyer and vendor advocate. I've got some formal property investing qualifications. Terry mentioned in my book. I do a lot of media commentary and known to be an industry thought leader. And in terms of the agenda today, well, what we're going to talk about is obviously where we're at now, the market, the data and key considerations, what happens when you buy in haste, what are the consequences in terms of repenting, and then some important buying considerations. So we mentioned this in our last webinar, Terry, and not a lot's changed. I mean, interest rates are low, and when we have stock levels that don't meet demand, we're basically going to continue to be in a situation where we're seeing prices increase until there's some sort of dramatic change. Employment levels have been steady, going on strong. There's now a shortage in certain industries for employees, and for the first time in a long time, minimum wages, and there has been wage growth as a result. We've got home buyers and investors in the marketplace. So investors are starting to come back in. They're starting to see opportunity and potential. So there's been an increase of that. And also what's driving the market is absolutely FOMO. We get people who are so exhausted and over the buying process, they get to the point where they'll pay anything to end their pain. And there's a solution to that. We'll talk about that as well. But we're also seeing a lot happening with the tree change, sea change, and what I say metropolitan escapees. Everyone's wanting to get out of the larger centres to go to regional areas to try and avoid and escape what's happening with COVID. But also what we're seeing is those lockdowns now actually moving out to the regional areas as well. So let's talk about what we've discussed before. There's not just one single national market. There are thousands of markets and submarkets. Prices can vary according to the suburb, the part of the suburb, even the side of the street. Property performance varies according to supply demand of stock, as I mentioned, and the buyer and the tenant type. And in particular, what's driving growth in the regional areas is absolutely affordability compared to the large metro centres. A lot of infrastructure development in some regional areas, lots of employment opportunities and industry in larger centres, but also the opportunity to have flexible working arrangements due to COVID. I'm seeing a lot of first home buyers who are priced out of major cities going to large regional centres because they can afford to buy a house there. They get really good bang for buck. They may only need to commute an hour to an hour and a quarter if and when they go to work, and their employer's happy for them to have that flexibility. As I mentioned, COVID, people are fleeing the city, but be careful what you buy. And of course, we've spoken about population growth happening in certain areas and investment into infrastructure as well. So what we want to look at is basically the data and key considerations when you're actually looking to buy a property. Now, this can apply whether you're buying a home or an investment property. The principles are the same. So some things you want to look at are what we call days on market. The longer a property sits on market, the less appeal that it has, and the more likely it is that it's going to struggle to sell over the long term, or it's usually an indication of there's something wrong with the property or a reason why it's not selling. So pay attention to that information. You want to be considering price growth in the area, not in the short term, not just looking at 1 or 2 year periods, but you want to look at what's happened over a 5 and 10 year period, just to give yourself a bit of an idea of the history of what's gone on. We'll talk about supply and demand factors. These are things that basically pull against each other to determine if there's longevity in any sort of capital growth. And then we want to talk about growth drivers and consider growth drivers for sustainable future growth as well. I'll expand on those shortly. The amount of land availability, this is a supply and demand issue. Employment opportunities or not in the area that you're looking at buying in. What sort of development applications have there been in that particular regional area? Particularly a lot of regional areas are having a lot of land subdivided and sold as house and land packages at the moment. So that's something to take into consideration, particularly in terms of the location and where you plan to buy in that region. Median house price you want to take into consideration. Now, this isn't an average, this is the midpoint of the value of sort of where properties have sold over a period of time. So if you're looking at the median for a particular quarter in a particular town or area, you're looking at where the midpoint was in terms of most of those sales, the middle between obviously the bottom of the range and the top of the range. You want to factor in unemployment levels, particularly if you're an investor and you're going to be a landlord. You absolutely want to know what the level of employment or unemployment is in the area that you're buying in, because that can go to the calibre of tenant that you might attract, and there are implications with that. Of course, never forget the condition of the property. I mentioned before that there's a lot of rubbish real estate hitting the market. Particularly in Victoria, we've now got the Residential Tenancies Act has got a requirement of 14 minimum standards that need to be met. And those landlords who've absolutely neglected their properties over the years and done nothing to maintain them are now dumping stock. So it's very much buyer beware when it comes to that. And then we want to take into consideration the household age, the income within that household, the occupancy type. And by that, I mean, do they rent, do they own outright, or are they paying off a mortgage? And then we want to talk about the structure of the household. So that could be couples with kids, couples without kids, singles with or without kids, lone households and group households. So all of that information there will paint a picture, firstly around the area in which you want to buy in, and then you need to drill down further. Now, I actually found a case study of a client where I did a portfolio review for her in 2012. And this was on a property that she bought in a place called Shorewall Park in Tasmania near Burnie. Burnie's a port town on the northeast coast of Tassie. She bought in what was a new estate on the fringe of Burnie itself. And effectively she bought it in 2010, but the local Burnie paper mill closed down in 2010 after failing to secure a buyer. And then the only thing that remained was the wood chip terminal, and that was the main source of forestry-based income. In its heyday, the paper mill, or the pulp rather, employed 3,500 people. And after 75 years of supporting families, it actually had to close down and cease operation in 2010. So she didn't do her research, but that's what she bought, where she bought, and she paid $270,000 for it. And in that particular suburb, the population consisted of 1,935 people. So when we did some analysis on it, what I was able to see was that the price point, the primary income levels of where most people were in that particular suburb was around the 25 to 36,000 per annum. And then we had a number of people earning 15 to 25,000 per annum. So pretty low from the point of view of, having an investment property, wanting to get maybe significant rent and significant capital growth. This was sort of who made up the suburb at the time. And we can also see here that from 2010, rather, or certainly the time that she bought the property, there'd been a period of time where prices had actually been declining significantly, both in that suburb and in that local government area. So what that showed to me at that time, particularly with the main source of employment shutting down, that the property had little opportunity to perform over the longer term because there didn't appear to be any economic growth foundation for prosperity. At the time, there was limited what we call net migration into Tasmania. And there's also a significant combination of single parent and share households with low income earners. And I also knew that 70% of people in that suburb were renters, and that obviously also affects a property's ability to grow in value. So it really didn't have a lot of appeal from the point of view of resale, capital growth, and even it was limited from an income perspective as well. So taking into account socioeconomic demographics as well, sometimes you can have issues with tenants actually, particularly when they're on low incomes, with tenants actually meeting their rental obligations and paying rent on time. So that's a consideration as well. So if we look at where we're at now, well, my client bought it in 2010 for $270,000 and I've just appraised it around the $375,000 mark. So there's a little bit that's been happening, they're just implementing in the tourism sector. They've created some mountain biking tracks and trails and accommodation to try and tap into that market. QantasLink has now re-established a transport route from Melbourne to Burnie, and that's recommenced. And they're just in the process of refurbishing their art and function centre from what was a $5 million government grant, Commonwealth government grant. But frankly, is it enough? And what would have happened if she had have sold the property at the time, which was the advice, and invested elsewhere? Well, I know at the time that days on market were quite high. There was an expectation that it could take up to a year for her to sell it then. Having said that, if she had have sold it and she had have taken that $270,000 or $300,000 then and invested it in somewhere like Ballarat, she would absolutely have a property now worth around the $650,000 mark. So take into consideration all of these things when you're looking to buy, particularly in regional areas, particularly in small townships, particularly in industries that have got limited employment opportunities, because these are some of the consequences that can come about. Okay, so let's look at the data. So this is some recent information that Terry's actually provided, so Hotspotting have provided. So on the surface, it looks good. So let's look at this little town in Gippsland called Locksport. It's got a population of 850 people. It's 270 kilometres east of Melbourne. It's got an economy based on tourism, and the median house price is $295,000. Now, it's actually gone up 21% in the past 12 months, including 8.5% in the last quarter. Now, the REIV has indicated significant reduction in days on market in particular regional towns in and around Victoria, but they're often coming off a pretty high base to start with. And Locksport is one of those towns where their days on market have now reduced by 100 days, which is actually phenomenal. And obviously there's an interest in the market for people wanting to do tree change, sea change, but you have to be wary of the data on the surface level. So what I see with this particular location here, you can see just when I did a quick search of the properties in the area, there's a heck of a lot of land and house and land packages for sale. There seems to be the capacity to continue to subdivide. for more land to come onto stock. So there's potential for future oversupply, and that's basically going to mean it's going to dampen capital growth into the future. Now, this is a coastal tourist town. In terms of industry, we can see here that there's a reliance on tourism, but we also know that the tourism industry has been decimated as a result of COVID over the last 15 months. And whilst this may have owner-occupier appeal, that's fantastic. But again, if you look at the surface data and it looks amazing, you have to have an expectation moving forward that it may not continue to perform at that rate. And you want to look at things like, quite frankly, flooding. I mean, I look at properties here and my biggest concern would be that any rise in sea levels could result in this patch of land going under. You want to make sure that you're going to be able to get insurance in a situation like this. So there's the emotional appeal of, we want to live in a beautiful Gippsland Lakes town. We want to have a block of land that's close to the water, but you want to take into account some of those considerations as well. So then let's have a look at another example. So this is also in Victoria. This is Stawell, slightly bigger population of 6,000 people, 250 kilometres west of Melbourne. Again, the economy is based on tourism and agriculture. Median house price is $240 and it's gone up 23% in the last 12 months, including 3% in the last quarter. Now, generally when you're buying in regional areas like this in very small towns, you want to be careful about paying too much more over and above the median price point. The reason is it's indicating where the majority of properties sit, and usually under a median point, it tends to be a little bit easier to sell a property. And as soon as you get over that median price point, you might have some challenges. So what I'm seeing here as well, lots of house and land packages. You know, people have possibly gone out there and either bought the land and built, and now they're trying to get the hell out and take their profit and run. And I can see also just in this image here that there's a lot of stock listed for sale if you just Google that suburb. And again, when you've got a very small population and a lot of stock for sale, you've really got to question why so many people are selling. And again, it indicates to me that there's also capacity in this area for continual expansion, more land to be subdivided and sold, and that's going to affect your capital growth into the future. So just be wary of those things if you're looking in a small town like that. I'll just give you a final example. Corumburra, South Gippsland. This has got a population of 3,600. It's 120 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. Again, the economy is based on agriculture and tourism. Median price point here is 440,000 and it's gone up 38% in the last 12 months, including 10% in the last quarter. And that's phenomenal. That's absolutely phenomenal growth. If it looks too good to be true, well, dig deeper. Obviously, whoever was in that market in those last 12 months, particularly with COVID, and that's what's driving it. You know, we've got our metro escapees who are going to these areas and pushing prices up, but things will slow down eventually. It's highly unlikely that this sort of growth will be sustainable in the long term. And so you need to do your research. Now, people are obviously buying lifestyle properties as well. There's a real desire not just to, you know, have your typical house and land in a country area, but buy something a bit bigger. So this is an example of a property that from memory was about 1,000 square metres, a little bit more, 6 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, big block of land, but it's selling for 1.1 million. And we can see that the median price point is 440,000. There's only one other property close by that's got a similar price point. And basically you're in a market where the majority of properties are significantly lower. So it's highly unlikely you're going to get anyone locally in that town who's going to upgrade from their median house price to a property like this. So you're suddenly going to be dependent on an out-of-towner, someone coming in from the city, someone with a lot more cash. They want to buy the dream. They like the idea of it. But there's also the practical side of it as well. So if you are looking for a lifestyle block, you want to take into account the services. You know, is there sewage connected? Is there gas connected? What's the power source? What about water? Tell me, you know, talk about flood and fire and drought. Are there dams? Is there adequate fencing? What are the outbuildings? And most of all, can you insure a property like this in that location with all of those considerations? So before anyone buys this kind of property, you absolutely want to speak to an insurance company and understand what those implications are. Plus, there's significant costs setting up a regional or a rural property like this so that you can live off the grid. And again, I appreciate people want to do that, nothing wrong with that, but there's significant cost in infrastructure to do it. And we know that we had massive storms in Victoria recently in the Dandenong Ranges. We know that the internet was cut. We know that power was cut. There were people who were living in the cold and the dark for many, many weeks at a time. And the odd few had battery storage and generators that they could draw from. So they're just some of the practical things you need to consider, particularly, obviously the Dandenongs is a Melbourne suburb, but particularly if you're going to be in a region, fairly remote region in a very small town where you don't have those things on hand as readily, they're definitely things you want to take into consideration. Oops. Okay, so buy in haste. Well, danger lies ahead. I don't know if anyone remembers Lost in Space. I certainly do. I'm old enough to remember that. So just remember, it's easier to get it wrong than get it right. It's really important not to get emotional. When people get emotional, even for their own home when they're buying it, you don't make good, clear-headed decisions. So being emotional or having had a traumatic event or just anything happen in recent times, you want to let the dust settle and be in a situation where you can think clearly. Often the cost of a mistake is going to be higher than any short-term gains you think you're going to get, or possibly even long-term gains. So there is value in seeking independent advice. It's really an insurance policy to make sure you're not making a mistake, whether it's a $600,000 mistake or a $2 million mistake or a $400,000 mistake. That's where getting independent advice and getting a professional to help you comes in. What I recommend if you need help, consider the cost of missing out on property or watching the market escalate because you're out of the market and not buying versus the cost of engaging someone and paying them a professional fee. And maybe draw a line in the sand. If you are going to go it on your own, give yourself maybe a month or 2 months. I mean, we could see with one of these suburbs that it went up 10% in a quarter. So, one of these regional areas. So just draw a line in the sand and say, right, we'll give it a crack ourselves. If after 30 days or 60 days we have no joy, let's get a professional in to possibly help us, if not for all of it, for part of it. And be aware now, if we're talking buyer agents, there are a lot of fake buyer agents out there. I've got a blog about that and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So what are the consequences if you do make a mistake? Well, I'm buying a lot of property regionally, particularly Ballarat and Geelong, and I'm seeing a lot of people paying or overpaying at purchase, and they're overpaying unconditionally. They're frequently buying properties where they're not doing due diligence like building and pest reports. They're not making the offer subject to finance. And the risk that comes with that is if they pay a ridiculous price and the bank doesn't value it at that same level, then it may be that there's a shortfall that they have to fund, and they may or may not have the cash to do that, which means they could actually not be able to settle. They could lose their deposit. They could then be liable if the property resells for less than what they bought it for, and then they're legally obligated to pay the shortfall there as well. So just be very, very careful. I'm seeing a lot of that, and I'm seeing a lot of bad practices coming up with regional agents too. There's a lot of this, give us your last and final offer. I don't play that game. I encourage them to run an auction because it's transparent, and I'm not going to throw my clients' money away when there's no evidence to support it through other competition in the marketplace being willing to compete. So that's a strategy you really need to be careful of and think carefully about. And just push agents to be transparent in what they're doing. This is one of the reasons why frequently they have bad reputations, because they play games or they play these last and best offer rubbish. And then they manipulate you to think that there's lots of competition, and if you don't do that, you're going to miss out. And they're masters at pulling on your emotions. So again, either get somebody else to do the negotiation for you who's not as emotionally attached, or insist that you're willing to, throw your hat in the ring, but you want it to be a transparent process. And that might be that they're disclosing other offers and letting you know what they are as they come in, or they're doing a virtual auction. And quite frankly, some of the regional agents need to start doing that. They're all behind the times because they're not jumping on board with that. And just insist on a transparent process. So again, the consequence of overpaying is you could have poor or no long-term capital growth. Remember, we're not looking at the short term, we're looking at the long term. We're currently in a seller's market. So if you bought a property that has got long days on market and you buy it and then you try and resell it down the track, that's an implication where you could struggle to sell, because selling in a buyer's market is much tougher than selling in a seller's market. So that's an implication you need to consider. You may have bought in a situation where, again, you've got a primary industry that's closed down or closing down. That can be a consequence if you act very hastily and haven't done your research. And you want to know about the effects of COVID and employment in the local area. I certainly know of someone who lives in Mount Martha. She couldn't get any work locally. She has to drive to Sorrento to work in a retail shop as a shop assistant. So that's a good 45-minute each day round trip, just so she can earn maybe $22 an hour, because there's otherwise no other employment locally, because Mount Eliza is very much a seaside, semi-retirement kind of holiday area. So just be aware of those sorts of things, particularly if you're looking to work full-time or even part-time. The smaller the township, the more remote it is, the more likely you're going to have to travel to get some work. Again, oversupply of a stock is a consequence if you're buying a house and land package or just land and you haven't checked what that future supply of land is or what development approvals have come into place. And it's not impossible that you may need to sell at a loss. Certainly if you bought it and kept it for less than 3 years, unless you bought what I call an A-grade property that will outperform the market and hold its value. I have had clients where we've bought regionally and 2 years later they've sold and they have walked away still having made a profit in spite of their stamp duty costs and their selling costs and all the rest of it. So be prepared if you bought badly, whether you've overpaid or you've just bought badly because there aren't sufficient growth drivers to support the growth of that property. You may need to be prepared to bite the bullet and sell the loss to move on. Or you may end up stuck for years at a time. Again, if you look at certain areas and certain properties and look at the days on market, you may see some of those properties have been there on listed for sale for 300 days, 400 days. And the bigger regional and rural properties, some of them are, listed for two, sometimes 3 years before they sell. So just be aware of those consequences. Terry, do you want to sort of throw in anything at this stage in terms of the data that we've spoken about so far?
Look, I'd like to refer to a comment that's come in from one of the people out there watching and listening, Janet. You used Locksport as a case study of a place where there's been considerable uplift in sales activity and prices. And as part of this, the frenzy that's in the market at the moment, but not necessarily a location that's got the long-term drivers to drive growth beyond the current spurt. And Janet's comment is that a lot of the increase at Locksport has been around the prospects of an offshore wind farm. She's spoken to a lot of people buying to capture the rush of accommodation required for that project. I thought that was interesting. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with this very, very massive offshore wind farm that's proposed off the southern coast of Victoria. My comment is always to people who feel compelled to buy in a location because of a major project that's proposed, to ask themselves the question, what if that project doesn't happen? Is it still a good place to buy? Will it still deliver long-term growth if that big project is not delivered? And certainly the history of Australia is littered with massive proposals that have precipitated a rush of real estate buyers to the area because of the prospect of that big project, but the project, for various reasons, hasn't gone ahead. And those people have been left with lemons on their hands. And so I think people need to be very wary about buying on the basis of one big project. Should always perhaps be targeting locations that have multiple strengths to their economy. And if there's major new infrastructure developments in the process, you want to be buying in places that have 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 big projects in prospect, so that if a couple don't go ahead, you're still safe.
And that brings us to our final slide. Look, I'm with you, Terry. I mean, respectfully, anyone who's punting it is gambling. If you're not going to go throw 200 or 300 grand on a table at Crown Casino, well, then don't do the punting that a project may or may not come off. I mean, there's plenty of people, particularly in WA and areas where there's been mining, where there's been wind of a contract coming up and employment and all the rest of it. And we've seen those mining towns boom and bust. We've seen people make very fast money in a short period of time and then they lose it very, very quickly, and it can change in a day, literally. So you can't expect that, you know, particularly if you're a low risk profile individual, this sort of gambling and punting on a project that may or may not come off is a high risk strategy. Be aware that you could make a lot of money, but you could also lose a lot of money. So again, it's just understanding that there's always risk when you invest. How much of that risk you choose to mitigate will be based on the research that you do and the decision that you make based on that research. But fundamentally, you're responsible for the decision that you make if it turns to muck, quite frankly, and there's no one to cry to, because if you're after the big bucks and you want to take the big risks, equally, you know, you might get that lemon and it could ruin your capacity to continue to grow your property moving forward, and you may well end up in that situation where it takes you years to get rid of it and you can't grow a portfolio. So the important things to take into consideration, and Terry just mentioned it, are macro and microeconomics. So macroeconomics is the supply and demand driven by population growth, land availability, housing starts, mineral exploration, tourism, infrastructure development, both state and federal, and business investment in infrastructure. So in an ideal world, you're looking at a property who's got, in an area that's got a lot of those boxes ticked. And from a microeconomic point of view, you want sustainable future growth, which is going to rely on population growth and migration. Obviously, the availability of amenities such as public transport, hospitals, schools, employment, and, you know, potentially a train line as well. So ideally take a long-term approach, not a short-term, and by long-term I mean 5-7 years plus. As I mentioned, you want multiple growth drivers in combination. When I work with investors, I never buy into a regional centre that's got a population of less than 80,000, because you won't find all that infrastructure that's there. You want to take into account stock on market, and those 3 examples that we looked at, there was a lot of stock on market in all of those areas, and that's a bit of a warning sign of people who maybe got in, you know, they've managed to be lucky, other people are punting, they're trying to get out of the market now and take their money and run. And if you're that second or third or fourth person down the line who wasn't there at the very, very beginning, you may get left with a lemon. Again, the employment opportunities. I mentioned before, if you're in a small area and there is no employment and that wind farm, for example, doesn't take off, well then where does someone have to drive to get work, and what's that going to cost them every day, and what kind of fatigue will they suffer? You know, I lived and worked in Margaret River many years ago in Western Australia. I worked for a property developer at the time, and my commute was a 2-hour trip every day. So there was an hour there and an hour back, and that was just the job and the commute that I chose to do to work for that organisation and live in that area. And it does wear thin. When you do that year after year after year, it's exhausting, so just be warned. Again, is there water that's plumbed? Is there sewerage? Is there, you know, gas that's not in bottles? What sort of power access do you have? Do you have to pay for off-grid costs? So again, in these smaller towns or you know, a lifestyle kind of property, factor that in. And as I mentioned before, insurance above everything else. But don't give up on the quality or the condition of the property either. You know, make sure you're still buying an A grade or a B grade property. You don't want to be buying a C grade. I've done plenty of webinars on this in the past, so you can go back on Property Mavens website and have a look at those. But don't forego the condition or the calibre of the property, particularly if it's in Victoria or a state where you've got minimum rental standards, because otherwise you're going to be ending up paying a lot of money to get it up to a level where you can tenant it. It may sit empty until you're in a position to do that. You may be buying a problem, and there's a lot of rubbish stock on the market, as I said, because vendors are desperate to get rid of properties that they're not going to update or put in any kind of condition that is either habitable or tenantable. We talked about local amenity, and we also talked about land supply. So they're the things you want to consider to ensure you're not going to make a mistake. So do we have any questions, Terry?
Lots of questions, Miriam, and I will start with one from Layla, because I think it's a very pertinent one I think that's probably occupying the minds of a lot of people out there. And Layla's question is, given FOMO and all the other frantic purchase behaviours we're seeing now, is it a good time to buy an investment property, or should we wait for things to stabilise? And I think a lot of people are asking that very question. Should they jump now, or should they wait till things settle down? What do you think, Miriam?
Well, look, no one's got a crystal ball. No one can forecast how any market's going to perform into the future. I mean, we can make educated guesses based on information. Certainly, once migration starts up again, I don't doubt that Melbourne and Sydney will continue the growth that they've had in recent years, and population levels will continue to increase, but we obviously need to wait until COVID settles down to facilitate that happening. Again, it depends on what you're buying and where you're buying. I always say to people, the time to buy is when the bank will lend you the money, because they change their policies on a daily basis. We've had government interference in the past where they've forced lenders to slow things down on the investment side, and we've seen the volatility of that, and we've seen markets go up and come down heavily and go back up again after COVID. So number one, buy when you've got the money, because you can't guarantee you'll get it. And rest assured, it is absolutely not as easy as you think it is. If you go on some online calculator or you talk to someone in a bank and they go, yeah, not a problem, rest assured it may take 6, 8, 12 weeks. Lenders are really backed up at the moment, so it's highly unlikely you'll get any money quickly if you're wanting to act straight away, and that's the first thing you need to do. Then you need to take into account your risk profile. Is it high, moderate, low? What's your strategy? Is it capital growth? Is it cash flow? Is it a balance of the two? Do you want to develop? Do you want to subdivide? Do you want to renovate? So your risk profile and your strategy and your budget will determine where the best places are to buy. And then, of course, it comes down to making sure you're taking a long-term approach. Absolutely, I'm still working with investors as I am home buyers. But like I said, providing A, you've got the money, B, your strategy matches your risk profile, C, you take a long-term point of view, and D, you're buying an investment-grade property and you buy well without overpaying, well then, yeah, absolutely, now's a good time to invest.
A lot of the questions, Miriam, that are coming through very much along similar lines. Terence, for example, is saying, I'd love to know your views about this FOMO housing boom. Is it going to last? How long do you think it will go for? Will there be a correction at the end of it? I think a lot of people are asking that question about the longevity of the current upcycle. I certainly think that given that, I know we've got a lot of simplistic analysis in media, particularly from economists who are talking about the level of interest rates as not only the prime factor, but the only factor that they talk about, whereas I've got 17 dot points on my list of reasons why we're in this upcycle. And yeah. I think it does have considerable longevity. It's not about the level of interest rate. So some subsequent increase from the Reserve Bank, although they're talking very persistently that they're not going to do that before about 2024, although there's a lot of speculation that they'll move sooner. But if they do, I don't think it's going to have any impact on this runaway train that we're dealing with at the moment, because it's not fundamentally about that.
Yeah, that's right. And I have to agree. I mean, certainly the government handed out a whole lot of incentives for people to build brand new. We saw a lot of house and land packages selling. We saw a lot of land subdivided. There are very, very long waits with builders to be able to build those properties. So that was designed to boost the economy as well as giving first home buyers a chance to get into the market. Across the board, we don't have enough housing to accommodate the population that we have, let alone future population growth from, immigration once that starts up again. That's been the case for a long time. We've had issues with bushfires a couple of years ago when all the forests and that supplying timber started to burn down. At the time, I did some blogging about it. My understanding was that the forestry sector had a very limited window of time in which they had to harvest that timber before it started to rot. I think it was a matter of, I can't remember if it was weeks or months, but they literally had to get that timber that was burnt superficially, harvested and then put into planks and then starting to season for use. And what that's resulted in now is an absolute shortage of supply of timber, because we've had enormous demand from new housing starts wanting to be built. housing wanting to be built, as well as, the lack of long-term planning from the government to make sure that there's been enough forestry and timber to accommodate, the demands that we have, let alone future demand as well. So like you, Terry, people have still bought properties when interest rates were at 3, 4, 5, 6%. If you can't sustain those sorts of increases, then you want to get into the market now, maybe lock in some rates for a period of time, pay down your debt as quickly as possible, but also still make sure it's affordable. But like you, Terry, I don't see any slowdown.
No, and in terms of the interest rates that people have paid in the past, the last time we had a major nationwide property boom similar to the one we have now was right at the start of the century, 2001, 2 and 3. People were typically paying 7.5% interest on their mortgage. And the previous one before that was the late 80s when interest rates went as high as 17%. I remember those days, everyone was paying double-digit interest rates in those days. They kept lifting interest rates and the boom just raged on. I don't think it's fundamentally about that at all. There's various other drivers that are put us in the market that we're now in. I think it's got considerable longevity, and I think that some of the major forces have yet to be really felt that are come in the near future. So I think it will roll on for some time. There's a question about immigration, and the question is, with immigration on the whole, what's the forecast for sustainable growth in real estate? And I think the question implies that immigration is really pivotal in this, and I really don't think it is at the moment. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, certainly that's a factor, and it's contributed in terms of a lot of property development and house and land packages and all sorts of things being built over recent years. But we've got strong enough local demand for it. And even without immigration, we still have less property supply to the demand that's needed. And opening immigration up again will only push that and increase that demand. So if anything, it's given people a bit of a breather where they're not competing with migrants for property, whether it's established or brand new, and obviously depending on residency status and so forth.
One of the factors I think that people have overlooked when considering the impact of the shutdown of overseas migrants coming into Australia is that it's been more than compensated by expat Australians returning to Australia. The numbers of expats coming back to Australia and buying real estate and lifestyle areas in particular is actually, the numbers are greater than we normally get from overseas migrants coming to Australia. So that's overcompensated for that factor. And I agree with you, when we do get back to some sort of normality and international borders do reopen, I think there's going to be an avalanche of overseas migrants wanting to come to Australia. It's certainly seen as a safe haven, both in terms of the pandemic and also in terms of the performance of our economy in difficult times. So I think that's a big factor that's still to come into the market, or some point in the future. There's going to be a second wave of demand when that's unleashed.
Yeah, and they've certainly seen that in Perth. I mean, property prices have been sitting at the bottom for quite a while now, but what's largely driven increases in Perth has been a lot of expats coming back. And of course, the lifestyle that's offered in Western Australia as well is what's attracting a lot of people too. And they've had a relatively lucky run compared to the rest of the country when it comes to, COVID sort of amongst the population, infections amongst the population. So, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Terry. I think if you can get the money now, buy now. Interest rates have never been as low. Yes, they're forecast to go up again, but definitely do your research, make some informed decisions. I can see someone here is asking about where you get that reliable data. Well, obviously, Hotspotting does a whole lot of reports where you can do national reports, local reports. You're obviously on Terry's database getting that information. So go there. So any other questions you want to sort of maybe?
Yeah, well, there's lots of questions here. We might focus on this question from Justine. You said, do you have any specific advice for first-time home buyers who don't have as much financial wriggle room to compete in this competitive market? She says, we know the basics. Just seems really difficult to get a foot in such a competitive market. Understand how she feels. Often think that the current market is a great argument for the need to have a good buyer's agent on your team because they have the experience to be able to deal with this sort of market conditions. But generally speaking, Miriam, what would your response be to Justine about the plight of first home buyers trying to get a foothold in a competitive market?
Yeah, I think reality check around what you want versus what you can afford is a big thing. I know when I bought my first property, I would have loved a nice little 3-bedroom brand new house and all the rest of it, but I ended up with a 1-bedroom apartment in Sandkuhler. I come from a generation where you started small and worked your way up. And I'm not suggesting that every first home buyer is willing to do that, but certainly when I work with home buyers of any budget, whether they've got 1.2 million or whether they've got 500,000, wish list and reality are often two different things. And in my experience, that wish list is here, reality is there, and I'm usually the bridge that gets people from one side of the river to the other, and it requires adjusting along the way. So if you've been looking, if you're seeing yourself priced out, if you cannot adjust on the financial side, then you need to look at possibly changing suburbs and going to an area where the land values are a bit lower and it's more affordable. You either need to change the property type, go from a house to a townhouse or a villa, change the size of it if you can, or buy a smaller block of land in the suburb that you want to be in. So you just need to look at the other areas where you have the capacity to be flexible if you can't, in fact, increase your budget. Again, on the website, there will be some webinars in the past where we've specifically done a webinar for home buyers and how to survive a fast market, things like that. So I'll just talk to that now and let people know where they can find that information. So if you do want to work with a buyer's advocate, I've written a blog called The Brides of Fake Buyer Agents, What to Watch Out For. So just go on to the Property Mavens website and under blog, you'll find that particular article. So that's got some really good bullet points in there and some questions to ask if you're interviewing an advocate. There's also the resources tab. So have a click on that tab. That's where you're going to find webinars that Terry and I have done in the past. If you're interested in anything about the growth drivers that we've spoken today, I've written about that in my book, Property Prosperity. You can buy an autographed copy from me on the website, or if you click that link to Kindle, you can actually download the book for $4.99. And it talks about the research, negotiate, and assess a part of it. And it also talks about risk profiling and all of that. So everything I've mentioned today, well, most of what I've mentioned today is in there. You can also download the free guides, common mistakes that people make, whether you're an investor or a home buyer or a super fund investor. Of course, anyone who wants help in Victoria, well, we can help you Australia-wide actually by referring to really good buyer advocates interstate. So if anyone does want a referral interstate, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, we work with first home buyers who are struggling to get in the market, upgraders, downsizers, investors, and we're happy to offer a free consultation. It's just a case of jumping on the website and filling in the form. We'll get in touch. And as I said, if people want help either regionally, locally or nationally, we're more than available to assist you. But definitely under the resource section, just check out the past webinars that Terry and I have done, and there's lots of information there to help you for first home buyers and people trying to get into a hot market, insanely hot market. I think that was the last webinar we did, Terry, wasn't it? How to buy in an insane market. Yeah. I remember the photo of Donald Trump triggering the insane part of it.
Absolutely. I do urge you, Justin, to persist. In many ways, it's a wonderful time to be a first-home buyer because the level of government assistance has never been higher and the level of interest rates has never been lower. There's also some compelling data being published recently showing that in many locations around Australia, it's actually cheaper to own than to rent. And it's not true in every location, but there's certainly plenty of incentive to get active and become a first-home buyer. And I know it's competitive and it can be difficult, but I urge you to persist and find a way to cut through that and take advantage of the opportunities. With the knowledge also that if you're buying in this current market, then in a couple of years' time, the way the market is moving, you will have created some equity and you will have an asset rather than continuing to pay rent.
Yeah, and on that note, can I just add that remember when you are buying a home, it is your biggest asset. You do absolutely want to apply investment fundamentals. I say that to clients all the time. Just because it's your home doesn't mean you don't buy an A-grade property, because you're going to rely on that for capital growth to leverage or upsize into your next one and your next one.
We're going to rely on that capital growth to leverage off that and then maybe build a property portfolio. And I do that with a lot of clients. We buy their first property, you get that right. Then you leverage the second, and then the capital growth of those two lets you get into the third. So it does have a snowball effect, but the first one's always the most important. Again, coming back to if you're looking for advice from an advocate, they don't have to do the full thing for you. They can coach you on the searching side, and then they can do an assess and negotiate opportunity for you as well. So there are different options for people at different price points and different brackets. But again, just understand that your home is your biggest asset and you want to make sure it's going to perform well.
One of the people out there watching and listening, Miriam, is asking a question which is right up your alley. What is a fake buyer's agent?
Okay, so there's been an influx of people in the industry who've come from no real estate background or experience whatsoever. They've basically done a 5-week online course that actually hasn't taught them how to be a buyer's agent. It's probably taught them how to market themselves as one, but not how to be one. And they've all gone interstate into New South Wales, where instead of, say, Victoria, you get your agent's rep certificate and then you're in the industry for a year before you can apply for a full license. That's designed so that you can be mentored in the industry, everything from understanding how to price property to filling in contracts and having someone, oversee you. And then obviously the license qualification is designed to happen over a 6 to 12 month period, where you're, again, getting a really good solid understanding of the local legislation. So the fake buyer agents often bypass that. They go to New South Wales, they get a license in 3 months, not actually living or working there. And then through mutual recognition, they come back, they manage to get a license here, even though they're not at all familiar with local legislation, or it might be Queensland, whatever the case may be. And they're out there marketing themselves as experts and they've never actually worked in the industry. So it's a little bit like, would you let a doctor perform surgery on you when they've never actually been trained? Would you let a hairdresser cut or colour your hair if they haven't done a 4-year apprenticeship? Well, unfortunately, these people are being told that they can make an enormous amount of money in a really short period of time. They can do it part-time. They can do it in conjunction with their other job. All they need is a laptop. They can do it from home. Easy, fast money. And unfortunately, it's attracted a lot of people that aren't suited to the industry. Not only do they lack emotional intelligence, but they lack the real estate experience. And while maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 in 700, might be okay, or if they've got a real estate sales experience or property management experience, they might be okay. More often than not, if you dig deeper and ask the questions that I've put together in the blog, if you dig deeper and ask those questions or have a look at that information, you'll find that there's not a lot of depth there. There's not a lot of experience there. And you're basically paying someone a significant amount of money and entrusting them to give you advice and insight, which comes with experience, and helping you make a decision worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And quite frankly, they're not qualified to do it. So that's what I call a fake buyer's agent. But as I said on the blog there, you're safe if you work with a REBA member. We're the Real Estate Buyers Agent Institute of Australia, so Google REBA. And we have a code of conduct and minimum requirements to be REBA members. So, there are members in every state that you can interview and engage. And yeah, as I said here, you want case studies, Google reviews, proven track records. You want to know what their actual real estate industry experience is. What their other experience is has no relevance. They might be a psychologist, which is lovely. They may have been a builder, that's great. But none of that is the same as having real estate sales industry experience, because if you don't know how the inside of a real estate agency works, you leave your clients vulnerable in terms of overpaying or being manipulated and making a property buying mistake.
Okay. Sean is asking, is it possible to buy a quality investment property for under $200,000?
Oh, look, I'm sure anything's possible. You just got to find where it's likely to be. Obviously, it's going to be regional, not metro. But I would suggest coming with that, you're going to have those issues that we spoke about before. It's unlikely to be in an area where there's employment opportunities, multiple growth drivers. Say a regional area like Ballarat, you might get an apartment of some sort, but then chances are it's going to be in a pocket of the suburb where demographically it's not that great. Then you're going to have all sorts of issues with tenants. So possibly somewhere like a Bendigo, for that price point, you might get a little villa unit. So again, you've got to do your research to find out which are the hotspots or the regional centres that are performing. Terry's got all the reports for that. Have a look at that information and then do some research within those areas to see what you get in that price point, and make sure, you know, it's an A-grade property, and make sure those growth drivers are there to support making that buying decision.
Yeah. I don't think it's possible for people to buy good investment property for under 300,000, and I can think instantly of locations. Some of them are in capital cities, most of them are in regional areas, but under 200,000, it's really difficult to find anywhere for median price under 200,000 for houses, certainly at the moment. Some of the northern suburbs of Adelaide, certainly, but I guess it depends on what you mean by quality investment property.
Well, and it's also, what are you compromising to buy at that price point? Because you're probably compromising something. And if you're compromising something that will affect your ability to earn capital growth or resell easily into the future, then don't buy it. You're better off looking at partnering with friend or family, pooling your resources, putting a partnership agreement in place to understand what will happen if and when one of you needs to or wants to sell, and then doing it that way. So if your options are, you've got a limited price point where you can't really do anything without being vulnerable and making a mistake, then see if you can put together, you know, some other people who may invest with you, and see if you can at least double your money. Because I know even regionally now, it's hard to buy well under 400,000 in the areas that I'm buying in, particularly say Ballarat. Geelong, you can't buy well under 600,000. You know, you do need to have more money than that available in certain regional centres now, because prices have escalated so rapidly.
Okay, now there was a question a bit earlier from Layla, I think. We've talked quite a bit about regional centres, and Layla's question is, what's your opinion about investing in the smaller capital cities rather than regional centres, and where do you see the greatest growth?
So we're talking Darwin or Adelaide?
Well, I think capital cities other than Sydney and Melbourne, really.
Well, I'll let you answer that one, Terry. What are you seeing with all your research?
Look, I think certainly the trend we're seeing, and I call it the exodus to affordable lifestyle, it's substantial, it's very influential. It's been going on for longer than the COVID period. And it's not just people moving to regional areas, it's also people moving to some of the smaller capital cities. A lot of the population drift, where people are leaving Sydney, for example, a lot of it's going to southeast Queensland, Brisbane and southeast Queensland. And so certainly I think Brisbane's coming into a period of substantial growth. And there's another question from Yugesh, what's your opinion of the 2032 Olympics in Brisbane? Well, I think that will be confirmed, we hope, and a decision tonight in Tokyo. And if that's the case, then I think Brisbane's going to get further impetus from that for various reasons. I also think Adelaide is a city worth considering, very affordable, good value for money, and a greatly improving economy. Those are the ones that would stand out for me. Perth also, sorry.
Sorry, keep going, Terry.
Perth also has prospects. I'm a little bit wary about markets like Darwin. I know it's absolutely raging again, but bear in mind that the upcycle that Darwin's now seeing, and it does appear to offer great value for money, but it's actually rising after 7 years of decline, and that's because its economy is so intertwined with the resources sector. And when the resources boom stops, the Darwin property market suffers. You always got to keep that in mind.
A little bit like Perth, but I think Perth's really benefiting from a combination of the resources market and the expats coming back in and being relatively clean on the COVID. One thing I'll say in terms of escaping to affordable lifestyles, just don't dismiss climate change. You know, we're having some pretty radical things going on around Australia and globally when it comes to flood, drought, fire. I mean, you name it, Australia's been through hell in the last couple of years. So my feeling is a lot of people who are escaping the rat race and going up north, particularly to those warmer climates, there may be a case where not everyone's going to cope with it. They may suffer culture shock and miss the attributes of what you get in a bigger city like Sydney and Melbourne. Certainly, I even myself considered, you know, do I want to buy a property in Adelaide and stay in this level of climate? You know, in terms of where I am in time to come, because, you know, Adelaide hasn't had the insane population growth that Melbourne did, but also Adelaide's getting hotter, and frequently the temperatures in Adelaide are hotter than what Melbourne gets. So don't underestimate climate change as maybe having an effect on prices, and particularly into the sort of next decades to come. I think people in hot climates are really going to struggle. And yeah, just also account for radical lifestyle changes. If you're coming from a big city like Sydney or Melbourne and you're going to a much smaller city, or you're going to a regional area, just make sure you can still commute back to the big city readily and easily if you want to, if you're sort of missing that lifestyle.
And your reference to climate, Justin's also asking the question about climate and insurance, and certainly that's a factor in markets, particularly in North Queensland, like Townsville and Cairns. Townsville, I think it's got good growth prospects, big infrastructure spend happening there, various other reasons why I think that will be a growth market. But one of the provisos is that you need to be aware that because of those locations get whacked by major weather events more frequently than other parts of Australia, the insurance premiums can be double or triple and quite prohibitive in some cases, and you need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, you can take a positively cash flowed property in a regional area or a sort of suburb out of Brisbane, and it looks great on paper, but once, you know, the rates look good and all the rest of it, but you know, once you start paying for insurance because, you know, it's prone to flooding, then your yield goes, you know, out the door, and suddenly you've got a negatively geared property and you may struggle to resell it into the future. Look at local rates notices as well. You know, again, the smaller towns, regional centres, rates can be a lot higher than in a metro area. Of course, you've got a smaller population, you've got less people funding the cost of what the councils need to do in terms of maintaining amenities. So your rates can actually be quite expensive as well. So that's something to take into consideration.
Okay, Miriam, we've just ticked over the hour, so it might be a good time to wrap it up. We haven't got to all the questions, we never do, but we've covered as many as we possibly can. I would urge people who have further questions or would like to find out more about what Miriam could offer to make contact. There's a number of questions that are related to Miriam, to the sort of areas that you operate in and what your fees are and all of that. And I would urge people to actually follow up after the webinar and actually ask those questions directly. And Miriam has helpfully just popped on the screen. Perhaps you could talk us through what people should do if they want to make contact or to follow up and ask some further questions.
Yeah, so if you need help selling or buying, whether it's in Victoria or nationally, as I said, I can refer you to some colleagues nationally. Just jump on the website where it says contact. You can fill in the free consultation, tick what help you need. I think there's also the ability to maybe put some notes in there as well. And then we'll get back in touch with you and see how we can help you. And there's no charge for the initial consultation, particularly if you're looking at engaging our services. But we've got a variety of different services. We offer property portfolio reviews, buyer advocacy, vendor advocacy, and the buyer advocacy is at differing levels as well to work with people's different budgets. So yeah, shoot through the inquiry and we'll call you back.
And I would urge people to actually take that step, follow up and make contact with Miriam and Property Mavens. I think one of the core messages for people interested in property investment is I always say to people, you need to build your team before you build your portfolio. It's important to have good advisors around you, people that you can depend on to help you achieve a good outcome as a property investor. And I think an excellent buyer's agent should always be part of everybody's team. Thank you, Miriam Sandkuhler of Property Mavens, for an excellent presentation. Let's do it again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, everyone, for your time today too.
Okay, everybody. Bye for now.
See you.